The merchant ship Providence cut through Charleston Harbor's gray waters on the morning of March 14, 1764. Its cargo was sugar, rum, indigo, and a woman who would unravel 3 family lines before the decade's end. Captain Rousseau stood at the bow, watching the city's church steeples pierce the dawn like accusing fingers. He'd made this crossing from St. Domingues 17 times, but never had his cargo troubled him like the woman chained in the hold. She hadn't spoken once during the 3-week voyage, hadn't wept, hadn't begged. She simply existed with an intensity that made grown men avoid her gaze. "Sir," his quartermaster had whispered 2 days prior, "the men won't go below anymore. They say she watches them. Even when she's sleeping, they swear her eyes follow." Rousseau had struck the man for superstition. But he'd felt it too, that peculiar weight in the air around her, like the pressure before lightning strikes. Charleston spread before them now, magnificent and grotesque. White mansions gleamed along the battery, built on rice and human misery. The harbor stank of salt, tar, and the particular sourness of an auction day. On the docks, enslaved people moved cargo, while merchants tallied their fortunes in ledgers bound in calfskin. This was the richest port in the American colonies. More enslaved Africans passed through Charleston than any other city north of Havana. Here, human beings were inventory. Here, suffering had a market price. And here, Jeanne would exact a reckoning that would echo through generations. The Delacroix family mansion stood at 47 East Battery Street, a three-story Georgian masterpiece of Charleston brick and marble, its gardens rolling down to the seawall where waves crashed against the foundations of old Charleston. From the third-floor window, Madame Celeste Delac, while watched the Providence dock with ivory opera glasses pressed to her pale face. "She arrives today, then," she murmured to her reflection. Her husband, Philippe Delacroix, had arranged the purchase through his contacts in St. Domingues. A gift, he'd called it. The finest house slave in the Caribbean, educated, trained in the French manner. "She'll elevate our household above the Beaumonts and Monroes combined." But Philippe didn't know what Celeste knew. He hadn't heard the whispers that followed Jeanne from plantation to plantation across the islands. He didn't know that 5 men had died by their own hands after owning her. He couldn't see what Celeste saw even now through her opera glasses, that some people carry devastation in their very bones. The woman being led from the ship moved with an uncanny grace despite her chains. Even at this distance, even through the distortion of morning light, Celeste could see the impossible symmetry of her face. The way dockworkers stopped mid-task to stare, the way even the gulls seemed to circle lower. "God have mercy," Celeste whispered. "Philippe, what have you brought into our home?" Charleston's slave market operated with the efficiency of any successful business. The Vendu Range on East Bay Street processed human cargo with the same meticulous attention merchants gave to sugar and tobacco. But today, the usual rhythms faltered. Jeanne stood on the auction platform at precisely 11:00, and the crowd fell silent. She wore a simple linen shift stained from the voyage. Her wrists bore the marks of recent shackles. Her feet were bare against the worn wood. By every measure, she should have been unremarkable. Another beautiful woman in a city that consumed beauty like it consumed rum and rice. But there was something in the way she held herself, something in the absolute stillness of her posture. She didn't cringe from the appraising stares of potential buyers, didn't lower her gaze in the submissive manner enslaved people learned to survive. Instead, she looked directly at each man in the crowd, one after another, with eyes the color of aged whiskey catching sunlight. And each man meeting that gaze felt something break inside himself. "Gentlemen," the auctioneer began, his usual bravado faltering. "Direct from St. Domingues, aged approximately 22 years, trained in household management, French and English languages, needlework, where are her papers?" interrupted Nathaniel Beaumont, patriarch of the Beaumont shipping empire. He was 63 years old, married 40 years to the same woman, father to 7 children, grandfather to 12. He was known throughout Charleston as a man of iron principle and colder business sense. He would be ruined within 6 months. The auctioneer shuffled through documents. Previous owner deceased, sir. Estate sale. All documentation in order. How did he die? Called Richard Monroe from the back of the crowd. The Monroe family controlled half the rice plantations in the Low Country. Richard was 38, handsome in the way wealthy men often are, married to a woman he ignored, and bored with every pleasure Charleston could offer. He would be found wandering the docks in a year's time, mind shattered, whispering a name no one could make him stop saying. The auctioneer cleared his throat. The previous owner's death was natural causes, gentlemen. Now, shall we begin the bidding at? I'll pay whatever Beaumont offers, plus 20%, said a voice from the platform's edge. Every head turned. Philippe Delac had appeared from the crowd like a spirit, his face flushed with something between desire and terror. He was staring at Jeanne with the expression of a man who'd just seen his entire future collapse and rebuild itself into a new and terrible shape. The woman is mine, Philippe said quietly. I purchased her before she left Saint Domingue. I'm here merely to collect my property. Beaumont stepped forward, hands clenched. Your property? By what authority? By the authority of gold, Nathaniel. The same authority you respect above all others. Philippe produced papers from his coat. Signed, sealed, and witnessed. The woman belongs to the Delacroix household. For a moment the two patriarchs faced each other across the crowded platform, and every person present understood they were witnessing something more than a commercial dispute. This was the opening move in a war that would consume Charleston's elite. And through it all, Jeanne stood silent, her amber eyes moving from one man to the next with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been something darker, something older, something that had been waiting a very long time for this particular moment in this particular city. The ride from the Vendu Range to East Battery took 12 minutes. Philippe sat across from Jeanne in the enclosed carriage, studying her with the intensity of a naturalist examining a new species. You understand English, he said. Not a question, yes, sir, and French, yes, sir, you're educated, unusual for, he trailed off, suddenly uncomfortable with the implications of his own observation, for a slave. Jeanne's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Yes, unusual. Philippe shifted in his seat. The carriage suddenly felt smaller. Your previous owner, how did he die? By his own hand, sir. He hanged himself in the cane fields at dawn. They found him swinging between the rows, face purple, tongue black. She delivered this information with the same tone one might use to describe the weather. The overseer said he was smiling. The carriage hit a rut. Philippe grabbed the leather strap to steady himself, but Jeanne didn't move. She remained perfectly balanced, perfectly still, as if the laws of physics didn't quite apply to her in the same way they applied to everyone else. And before him, Philippe asked, though every instinct screamed at him to stop asking questions. Before him there was Monsieur Levesque. He walked into the ocean one morning and kept walking until the water closed over his head. Before him was Monsieur Duchamp, who purchased a pistol and shot himself in the mouth during Sunday Mass. Before him, enough, Philippe's voice cracked. Why are you telling me this? Jeanne met his eyes fully for the first time. In the dim carriage light, her irises seemed to shift color, amber to gold to something deeper and more dangerous. Because you asked, sir, and because you should know what you've purchased. The carriage arrived at the Delacroix mansion. Through the window, Philippe could see his wife waiting on the portico, his son Thomas standing beside her, his daughter Marie peeking from behind the columns. His whole family assembled to greet the new acquisition that would elevate their social standing. They had no idea they were welcoming their own destruction. Jeanne stepped down from the carriage with fluid grace, her bare feet touching the crushed shell driveway. She looked up at the mansion's facade, at the Palladian windows and Widow's Walk, at the wealth built on the backs of people who looked like her. And somewhere deep in her chest, something ancient and patient smiled. "Welcome home, mademoiselle," said the head butler, Samuel, himself enslaved, his voice carefully neutral. Jeanne turned to him. For just a moment, her expression softened into something human, something sad. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'm sorry." Samuel frowned, confused. "Sorry for what, miss?" But Jeanne was already moving toward the house, following Madame Celeste through the grand entrance, disappearing into the shadows of the foyer. Samuel stood on the drive, feeling suddenly cold despite the warm March afternoon. He couldn't have explained why, but he knew with absolute certainty that something terrible had just crossed the threshold of 47 East Battery Street. Something that had been waiting centuries for this moment. Something that would burn Charleston's elite families to ash before it was finished. Jeanne stood at the window of her small room on the third floor, looking out over Charleston Harbor. The city spread below her like a jeweled necklace, beautiful and obscene, wealth and misery existing side by side with the casual cruelty that defined the American colonies in 1764. She'd been given a room to herself, another sign of her elevated status within the household hierarchy. The other enslaved people whispered about it, about her. She'd heard them in the hallways, seen them cross themselves when she passed. They were afraid, good. Fear was honest. Fear recognized truth when it stood before you in human form. From her pocket, Jeanne withdrew a small cloth bundle. Inside was a lock of hair, gray and brittle, cut from the head of her mother on the day they'd been separated at auction in Port-au-Prince. Jeanne had been 7 years old. She could still remember her mother's last words, whispered in a language the traders didn't understand. Remember everything. Let them think you're broken. Learn their ways. Learn their weaknesses, and when the time comes, show them what justice looks like. Jeanne had remembered. For 15 years, she'd moved through the households of the wealthy, watching, learning, understanding the specific architecture of their cruelty. She discovered something remarkable. Powerful men were remarkably easy to destroy. Their pride made them blind. Their desire made them stupid. Their certainty that they were owed the world made them incapable of recognizing danger until it had already consumed them. She tucked the lock of hair back into her pocket and turned from the window. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tomorrow, she would start dismantling the Delacroix family with the same methodical precision they'd used to build their fortune on human suffering. And when the Delacroix fell, the Beaumonts and Monroes would watch and think themselves safe. They would be wrong. Jeanne lay down on the narrow bed, closed her eyes, and dreamed of fire.